Imagine, just imagine, that you are a wounded veteran. You lost a limb in Afghanistan. You spent months in rehabilitation. You battled depression, post-traumatic stress, the kind of darkness that most people will never understand. And then someone told you about a charity, a games, a movement, something created by a prince, a real prince who said he understood, who said he'd walked among soldiers, who said this was about you. You believed him, you trained, you competed. You cried tears of joy on that podium. You told the world that the Invictus Games saved your life. And now we're learning that behind the scenes, behind the cameras, behind the Netflix deals, behind the designer outfits and the private jets and the five-star hotel suites, the money that was supposed to protect you, to support you, to insure you, may have been hemorrhaging out the back door, and the man at the top. The prince who said this was about you, he's reportedly begging his father, the King of England, to make it all go away. A $2.4 million lawsuit. Demands for complete financial transparency. Investors and donors asking questions that Harry and Meghan apparently do not want to answer. And at the center of it all, the Invictus Games Foundation. The one thing that even Harry's harshest critics used to say was genuinely good. Let's get into it. So here's what we know. A lawsuit valued at approximately $2.4 million has emerged that is demanding something very simple. Something that any legitimate charity should have no problem providing: financial records. That's it, that's the ask. Show us where the money went. Now, for most charities, this would be a routine matter. You open the books, you show the receipts, you demonstrate that donor money went where it was supposed to go. End of story. Cup of tea. Move on, but not here. Not with Harry and Meghan, because according to multiple reports, there is a concerted effort to resist this disclosure, to keep these records sealed, to prevent the public and, more importantly, the donors, the investors, and the veterans themselves from seeing exactly how funds were allocated within the Invictus Games ecosystem. Now, let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with this question. Why would a charity built on the sacrifices of wounded veterans, fight to keep its financial records hidden? What possible reason could there be? If everything is above board, if every pound and every dollar went exactly where it was supposed to go, then transparency should be welcomed. It should be celebrated. It should be the easiest thing in the world. Unless, of course, the records tell a different story. Unless the records show something that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle cannot afford, literally and figuratively, for the world to see. To understand how we got here, we need to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the moment when Meghan Markle didn't just enter Harry's life, she entered his foundations. Now the Invictus Games were founded in 2014. And by all accounts, in those early years, the initiative was genuine. Harry had served. Harry had seen combat. Harry had watched friends come home broken, and he wanted to do something about it. Fair enough. Credit where credit is due, but then came Meghan. And with Meghan came something that observers have noted with increasing alarm over the years: a fundamental shift in how the foundation operated. Suddenly, it wasn't just about the veterans anymore. It was about the brand, the Sussex brand, the Meghan brand, and brands, as we all know, are expensive. Multiple sources have pointed to what can only be described as extraordinary expenses charged to foundation accounts. We're talking about multiple designer outfits. Not one, not two, but wardrobes curated for each public appearance, each carefully choreographed photo opportunity. We're talking about top-tier luxury hotels. We're talking about chauffeur services. We're talking about security details that would make a head of state blush, all charged, reportedly, as foundation expenses. Let me say that again, because I want it to sink in. While wounded veterans were being told that this charity existed to serve them, money was allegedly flowing toward luxury accommodations, designer clothing, and premium travel arrangements for the charity's most prominent faces. Charity work. That's a lifestyle subsidy. And the irony, oh, the bitter, exquisite irony, is that these are the same two people who left the royal family claiming they wanted to be financially independent. They wanted to stand on their own 2 feet. They wanted to escape the gilded cage. What they apparently wanted was a different gilded cage. One where they controlled the gold. Now, here's where things get genuinely fascinating from a psychological perspective. Harry and Meghan have built their entire post-royal identity on two seemingly contradictory pillars. On one hand, they demand privacy. Absolute, ironclad, legally enforced privacy. They have sued newspapers. They have sued photographers. They have issued cease and desist letters to media outlets around the world. Privacy, they tell us, is sacred. On the other hand, they have done a multi-million-dollar Netflix documentary series. They have published a memoir, Spare, that revealed intimate details about the royal family that would make a tabloid editor blush. They have done sit-down interviews with Oprah Winfrey watched by tens of millions of people worldwide. Meghan has launched a lifestyle brand. They have podcast deals. They have an Instagram presence meticulously curated to project exactly the image they want the world to see. So let me get this straight. Privacy when it comes to financial records. Privacy when it comes to how charity money is spent. Privacy when it comes to the books and the budgets and the receipts. But maximum exposure, maximum blinding relentless exposure, when it comes to their personal brand, their victimhood narrative, their carefully managed public image. Does anyone else see the pattern here? Privacy isn't a principle for Harry and Meghan. It's a tool. It's deployed strategically, selectively, and always in service of protecting whatever they don't want the world to see. And right now, what they don't want the world to see is where the Invictus money went now. Let's talk about something that isn't getting nearly enough attention. The governing board of the Invictus Games Foundation, because Harry didn't seal those records alone. Someone, or a group of someones, approved the decision to restrict access to financial information. Someone sat in a boardroom and said, yes, let's keep this under wraps. Someone signed off on the expense reports. Someone looked at the line items, the hotels, the wardrobes, the chauffeurs, and said, this seems fine. Who are these people? What are their connections to Harry and Meghan? And why has no one, not a single major media outlet, not a single regulatory body, demanded answers from them? Because here's the thing about charity governance. The board exists to protect the mission. The board exists to ensure that donor money serves its intended purpose. The board exists as a check on exactly the kind of excess that is now being alleged. If the board failed in that duty, if the board looked the other way while foundation funds were redirected toward personal luxury, then the board is complicit. Full stop. And if the board actively sealed records to prevent public scrutiny, that's not governance. That's a cover-up. The governing board of the Invictus Games Foundation needs to be investigated. Not next month, not next year. Now, and while we're on the subject of institutional failure, let me tell you something that should make your blood boil. The Invictus Games, a sporting competition specifically designed for wounded, injured, and sick armed services personnel and veterans, reportedly did not have adequate insurance for its participants. Let that marinate for a moment. These are men and women with existing injuries, amputees, people with traumatic brain injuries, people with severe physical limitations who are being asked to compete in demanding athletic events. And the organization bearing their patron prince's name couldn't be bothered to ensure they were properly insured. Where was the money going, if not toward protecting the very people the games were created to serve? We've just discussed the designer outfits, the five-star hotels, the chauffeur services, the luxury travel arrangements, but there wasn't enough in the budget for insurance. This isn't incompetence. This is a statement of priorities, and the statement is devastating. It says, the brand matters more than the veterans. The image matters more than the injured. The lifestyle of the people at the top matters more than the safety of the people at the bottom. The Invictus Games budget. According to those who have examined what limited information is available, appears to be wildly out of control. The spending patterns don't match what you'd expect from a charity of its size and stated mission. The numbers, to put it bluntly, don't add up. And yet, and this is perhaps the most maddening part of the entire story, the UK media has been largely, conspicuously, deafeningly silent. Why? Is it legal intimidation? Is it the army of lawyers that Harry and Meghan deploy at the first sign of scrutiny? Is it fear of being labelled racist or anti-progressive? Or is it something else, some unspoken agreement within the media establishment that certain stories are simply too dangerous to touch? Whatever the reason, the silence is deafening. And the veterans, the real victims in all of this, deserve better now. Let's address the elephant, or should I say the Duchess, in the room. Because as this lawsuit unfolds, and as demands for financial transparency intensify, something very interesting is happening. Meghan Markle's name keeps coming up, and not in a flattering context. Multiple observers have noted that the financial irregularities within the Invictus ecosystem appear to coincide with Meghan's increasing involvement in Harry's charitable work. The timeline is suggestive, to say the least. Before Meghan, the foundation operated with relative transparency. After Meghan, the walls went up, the expenses ballooned, and the records were sealed. Correlation isn't causation. I know that, you know that. But when the correlation is this stark, this consistent, and this well documented, it demands investigation. And here's what makes Meghan's potential implications so significant. This isn't just about one charity. If financial misconduct is proven within the Invictus framework, it opens the door to scrutiny of every Sussex-affiliated organization. Every foundation, every partnership, every deal. The entire Sussex financial ecosystem, Archuel included, would suddenly be fair game. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Harry is reportedly turning to the one person he has spent the last 4 years publicly savaging. His father. The image is almost too perfect to be real. Prince Harry, the man who sat across from Oprah Winfrey and implied his father was complicit in institutional racism. The man who wrote a best-selling memoir detailing every perceived slight, every cold moment, every failure of paternal warmth. The man who compared living in the royal family to being trapped in a zoo. That man is now, reportedly, reaching out to King Charles for intervention, for help, for rescue. Let's pause and appreciate the sheer, breathtaking audacity of this. You don't get to burn every bridge, salt every field, and poison every well, and then show up at the castle gates asking for a bucket of water when your own house catches fire. But that's apparently exactly what Harry is trying to do. And what exactly does he expect Charles to do? Use the weight of the crown to suppress a legitimate legal proceeding. Lean on institutions to make a lawsuit disappear. Deploy royal influence to shield his son from the consequences of his own financial management. Because if that's the ask, it's not just desperate. It's an admission. It's an admission that Harry knows what those financial records contain. It's an admission that transparency would be catastrophic. It's an admission that the books cannot withstand public scrutiny. If the records were clean, Harry wouldn't need his father. He'd need an accountant and a press release. The fact that he's reportedly turning to the king tells you everything you need to know about what's in those files. Let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Because when you step back, when you stop looking at individual incidents and start looking at the pattern, what emerges is something truly remarkable. And I don't mean remarkable in a good way. What emerges is an architecture of deception so elaborate, so multi-layered, and so carefully constructed that it almost commands a perverse kind of respect. Think about it. Every time a legitimate question has been raised about Harry and Meghan, about their finances, about their claims, about their narrative, what has happened? A counter-narrative has been deployed, a distraction, a pivot, an accusation. Questions about financial transparency become accusations of racism. Questions about charitable spending become lectures about mental health. Questions about truthfulness become stories about media persecution. It's a pattern, and it works. It works because most people, most journalists, most commentators don't want to be seen as attacking a biracial woman or questioning someone's mental health struggles. So they back off, they move on, they let the story die. But this time might be different. Because this time the questions aren't coming from tabloid journalists or online commentators. They're coming from lawyers. They're coming from investors. They're coming from people who put real money into real organizations and want to know where that money went. And lawyers don't care about being called racist. Investors don't back down because someone cries on television. Legal proceedings don't evaporate because you release a statement through your communications team about the toll this is taking on your well-being. This time, the deflection playbook might not work, and through all of this, through the lawsuits and the luxury and the legal maneuvering. Let us never forget who the real victims are: the veterans, men and women who served their countries with honor, who sacrificed their bodies and their minds in service of something greater than themselves, who were told that the Invictus Games would be their sanctuary, their community, their path to healing. These are not abstract figures. These are real people, people with names and families and stories, people who trained for months in the hope that competing would give them purpose, people who stood on podiums with tears in their eyes because for the first time since their injuries they felt whole, and they were used as props in a branding exercise, used as backdrops for photo opportunities, used as emotional leverage in Netflix documentaries, used to generate the goodwill and public sympathy that funded a lifestyle they could never imagine. If the allegations are proven true, if the financial records reveal what many suspect they reveal, then Harry and Meghan didn't just mismanage a charity. They exploited the most vulnerable, most deserving people in their orbit for personal gain. There is a word for that, actually, there are several words. The most accurate one is this: unconscionable. So where do we go from here? The lawsuit is proceeding. The demands for financial transparency are intensifying. The pressure is mounting from multiple directions: legal, public, and institutional. Harry and Meghan, if past behavior is any indication, will pull every trick in the book to avoid disclosure. Expect emergency court filings. Expect procedural delays. Expect sudden charitable announcements designed to generate positive headlines. Expect possibly another bombshell interview designed to shift the narrative and reframe the Sussexes as victims rather than suspects. They will do anything to keep those records sealed because they know what's in them. And they know that once those numbers see the light of day, the game is over. Not just for Invictus, not just for Archewell, for the entire Sussex enterprise. The speaking engagements, the Netflix deals, the brand partnerships, all of it depends on public goodwill. And public goodwill evaporates the moment people realize they've been conned. The Invictus Games Foundation, for its part, needs to do something it should have done years ago. It needs to separate itself from Harry and Meghan. It needs to bring in independent auditors. It needs to open its books voluntarily before the courts force it to. And yes, it needs to seriously consider whether Prince Harry's continued involvement serves the mission or undermines it. Because the mission is supposed to be about the veterans, not about the prince, not about his wife, not about them. Me leave you with this thought: there are good people in this world, good charities, organizations run by decent human beings who work tirelessly, often for little or no pay, to make their communities better. People who raise money and spend every penny of it on the people they've promised to help. Those charities exist. They're in your towns, they're in your neighborhoods. They're run by people you know, people who would be horrified, genuinely horrified, at the idea of charging a designer wardrobe to a foundation expense account. If this story has made you angry, and it should channel that anger into something productive, support your local charities. Donate to organizations with transparent financial records. To groups that can show you line by line where your money goes, because the best antidote to grifters is generosity directed toward people who deserve it. Harry and Meghan chose their path. They chose the mansions and the private jets and the victimhood narrative and the relentless, exhausting self-promotion. And now perhaps the bill is coming due. The truth has a way of surfacing. It might take months, it might take years, but financial records don't lie. Numbers don't spin. Receipts don't care about your feelings. And somewhere in a filing cabinet or a database or a lawyer's office, there are records that tell the real story of the Invictus Games. The real story of where the money went. The real story of who benefited and who was betrayed. The Invictus Games. For those who need a refresher, the Games were launched in 2014 as a multi-sport event for wounded, injured, and sick armed services personnel and veterans. The concept was genuinely inspired. Take the competitive fire that military training instills in people. Give injured veterans an arena to channel that energy. Build a community around shared experience and mutual support. Show the world that these men and women are not defined by their injuries. On paper, it is one of the most noble ideas in modern philanthropy. And in those early years, before the Sussex brand took over, before the red carpets and the documentary crews and the carefully staged emotional moments, there is evidence that it genuinely delivered on that promise. Veterans competed, communities formed, lives were changed. So what happened? What always happens when the wrong people get too close to something good? The mission got buried under the brand. The veterans got replaced in terms of institutional priority by the image. And the money, the donor money, the corporate sponsorship money, the money given by ordinary people who believed in what the game stood for, that money started flowing in directions that had very little to do with wounded veterans, and very much to do with the comfort and convenience of those at the very top. Now, I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough in these conversations, and that is the psychology of a grift. Because what is alleged here, and I want to be precise, these are allegations. The legal process will determine what is proven. But what is alleged here follows a pattern that is extraordinarily well documented in the history of charitable fraud. It never starts with grand larceny. It never starts with someone sitting down and saying, right, let's steal millions from veterans. It starts small. It starts with what feels in the moment like a reasonable justification. The logic goes something like this. We are the face of this organization. We bring in the donors. We attract the corporate sponsors. We generate the media coverage that makes this charity visible. Without us, there is no charity. Therefore, it is not unreasonable for our expenses, our travel, our accommodation, our appearance to be covered by the foundation. That logic, applied carefully and incrementally, is how designer wardrobes end up on charity expense reports. That logic is how 5-star hotels become standard operating procedure. That logic is how chauffeurs and security details and first-class flights become line items in a budget that was supposed to fund athletic equipment and rehabilitation programs. It is the logic of people who have confused their own importance with the institution's importance, who have come to believe that because they are valuable to the charity's resources exist to serve them. It is, at its core, a profound moral inversion, and if the allegations against the Invictus Games Foundation are proven, it is an inversion that occurred on a staggering scale. Let's talk about Meghan Markle, because you cannot have this conversation honestly without talking about Meghan Markle. I am going to say something that will make some of you uncomfortable, and I am going to ask you to stay with me through the discomfort, because the point matters. Meghan Markle is an extraordinarily intelligent woman. I mean that without sarcasm and without qualification. She is perceptive, she is strategic, she is disciplined, and she is exceptionally skilled at reading rooms and shaping narratives. These are not small gifts. In many contexts, they would be extraordinary assets, but intelligence deployed without integrity is not a virtue. It is a threat. Because when you apply that level of strategic thinking to the project of protecting yourself from accountability, when you understand exactly which cultural pressure points to press to shut down legitimate scrutiny, when you know precisely how to weaponize the language of social justice to deflect financial questions, that intelligence becomes something else entirely. It becomes a machine for sustained, sophisticated deception. Consider the pattern. Every time a serious question has been raised about the Sussex operation, about their finances, about the truthfulness of their public claims, about the management of their charitable work, what has followed? Not transparency, not an invitation to examine the record. What has followed is a masterclass in narrative control. Suddenly there is a racism accusation. Suddenly there is a mental health crisis being invoked. Suddenly there is a media vilification story that positions the questioner as the villain and the Sussexes as the persecuted innocent. It is breathtaking in its consistency. And it has worked for years, because most institutions and most individuals simply do not have the stomach for the fight that follows when you push back. But now the fight is being had in courtrooms, and courtrooms operate by different rules. In a courtroom, you cannot simply accuse the opposing counsel of racism and expect the case to be dismissed. In a courtroom, the discovery process means that financial records must be produced regardless of how uncomfortable their contents might be. In a courtroom, The strategic deployment of emotional narratives carries precisely zero legal weight. This is why this moment is different from every previous moment of Sussex controversy. This is why this lawsuit matters in a way that tabloid stories and online commentary simply do not. The law does not care about your brand, and let us spend a moment on the insurance question, because it is in many ways the most damning single detail in this entire story. The Invictus Games did not have adequate insurance for its participants. I want you to think about who these participants are. These are not weekend warriors. These are not recreational athletes taking part in a fun run. These are people who are already injured, people competing with prosthetic limbs, people managing the physical consequences of combat injuries, people whose bodies have already been through extraordinary trauma and who are now being asked to push those bodies in athletic competition. The absolute baseline requirement for any organization putting these individuals in competitive athletic situations is comprehensive, robust insurance coverage. That is not a luxury, that is not a nice to have, that is the most fundamental duty of care imaginable, and they didn't have it. Meanwhile, according to the allegations, the foundation was covering multiple designer outfits for public appearances. Multiple, not one outfit per event, multiple outfits. The kind of wardrobe curation that speaks not to necessity but to vanity. The kind of expenditure that signals with brutal clarity where the real priorities lay. One of these things was funded, the other was not, and the thing that was not funded was the safety net for injured veterans. If there is a more complete and damning indictment of the moral priorities at the top of this organization, I cannot imagine what it would look like. Now let us discuss the board. Because the board is the piece of this puzzle that has received the least public attention, and it may ultimately be the most consequential. Every registered charity has a governing board. That board carries legal and fiduciary responsibility for the organization's operations. They are not figureheads, they are not ceremonial. They have actual legally enforceable duties to ensure that the charity operates in accordance with its stated mission, that donor funds are spent appropriately, and that the organization maintains the kind of financial transparency that public trust requires. If what is alleged is true, if expenses were inflated, if funds were misdirected, if insurance was neglected, then the board either knew or should have known. Those are the only two options. If they knew, they are complicit. If they did not know, they failed catastrophically in their most basic governing responsibilities. And if they are the ones who made the decision to seal the financial records, to actively prevent public scrutiny of the foundation's accounts, then we have moved well beyond negligence into something far more troubling. Sealing records is not a neutral administrative act. It is a choice. It is a choice made by specific people who sit in specific seats, and who made a specific decision that the public, including the donors whose money funds this entire operation, should not be permitted to see where that money went. That decision has a word too, and the word is obstruction. The governing board of the Invictus Games Foundation needs to face the same scrutiny as its most prominent patron. Their identities, their connections to Harry and Meghan, their decision-making processes, and their role in any record-sealing activities need to be examined in full. Because if Harry is the face of this alleged grift, the board may well be the machinery behind it. Let's talk about the bigger context, about what the Invictus situation tells us about the entire Sussex project, because this did not begin with the Invictus Games Foundation. It began in many ways the moment Meghan Markle walked into Harry's life and identified, with that razor-sharp strategic intelligence we discussed, exactly what his charitable position represented. It represented access. Access to donor networks, access to corporate sponsors, access to high net worth individuals who wanted the prestige of association with a royal prince and his causes. Access to a global platform that could be leveraged in ways that pure celebrity, without the royal connection, could never achieve, and it represented something else. Something more subtle but equally valuable. It represented a shield, because when your primary public identity is tied to a charity for wounded veterans, criticism becomes extraordinarily difficult. Who wants to be the person attacking the Invictus Games? Who wants to be seen as going after wounded veterans? The association provides a moral armor that is almost impenetrable. Almost. The shield works until the people behind it do something so egregious, so contrary to the stated mission, that the veterans themselves become the argument against those running the show rather than for them. And that is where we are now. The veterans are not protecting Harry's reputation anymore. The veterans, or more precisely the questions about how the Foundation served them, are the sword pointed directly at his chest. I want to address something that some of you may be thinking. Some of you may be wondering whether this is all too convenient, whether the timing of this lawsuit and these revelations is politically motivated, whether there are people in the British establishment, in the royal family's orbit, who benefit from Harry's destruction and who may be engineering or amplifying these stories. It is a fair question, and I will give you a straight answer. It does not matter. The source of a legitimate legal action does not determine the validity of that action. If there is a $2.4 million lawsuit demanding financial transparency from a registered charity, that lawsuit has merit independent of who filed it and why. If there are financial records that show irregular spending patterns, those records speak for themselves regardless of whose interests their disclosure serves. We do not get to disqualify accountability mechanisms because we suspect the motives of those demanding accountability. That is not how justice works. That is not how financial oversight works. That is not how truth works. If the records are clean, transparency will prove it. Simple as that. The only reason to fear transparency is if the records are not clean, and now we arrive at King Charles. This is the part of the story that, if it were fiction, you would reject as too on the nose. Too perfectly ironic, too dramatically satisfying to be believable. Harry, the man who has done more damage to the British monarchy's reputation in the last 4 years than any single individual in living memory. The man who sat in Opera's garden and made implications about his family that reverberated around the world. The man who published a memoir that exposed private conversations, intimate family moments, and deeply personal details about his father and brother. The man who, in his relentless pursuit of victimhood and validation, treated the institution that made him as a prop for his own narrative. That man is now reportedly reaching out to King Charles, not to apologize, not to reconcile, not to repair the extraordinary damage he has done to his family and to the institution. No, he is reaching out because he needs something. He needs the power and influence of the crown to intervene in a legal process that threatens to expose him. He is not coming home, he is coming for help. And the question that I suspect King Charles is sitting with right now, in whatever private moments a monarch allows himself, is whether a father's love is sufficient reason to compromise the integrity of the crown on behalf of a son who has shown, repeatedly and publicly, that he does not reciprocate that love in any meaningful way. My instinct. Charles will not intervene. Not because he doesn't love his son, I believe he does, in the complicated, painful way that parents love children who have wounded them deeply, but because Charles understands, better than almost anyone alive, what the crown represents and what it cannot be used for. The crown cannot be a shield for financial misconduct, not even for a prince, not even for his son. If Harry wants saving, he is going to have to find another way. There is a concept in architecture called load-bearing walls. These are the walls that are not merely decorative, they are structural. They hold the building up. Remove a load-bearing wall and the entire structure becomes unstable. Remove enough of them and the building collapses. Harry and Meghan have built their post-royal life on what they believed were solid foundations. The sympathy of the public, the protection of the victimhood narrative, the moral armor of their charitable work, the legal deterrence of their lawyers, the narrative control of their communications operation. These were their load-bearing walls. And right now, one by one, those walls are being tested in ways they have never been tested before. The public sympathy is eroding. Polls consistently show declining support for the Sussexes across virtually every demographic. The victimhood narrative is being challenged by their own behavior. It is very difficult to sustain a credible persecution narrative when you are simultaneously building a commercial empire. The charitable armor has been stripped away by the very allegations that surround the Invictus Games. The legal deterrence has failed to stop this lawsuit from proceeding. And the narrative control, the greatest Sussex weapon of all, is struggling to contain a story that is being driven not by journalists but by legal proceedings. When load-bearing walls fail, buildings do not collapse slowly. They collapse suddenly. And then all at once. So what does justice look like in this situation? What should actually happen? It is worth being clear about this, because justice here is not about revenge, and it is not about satisfying the appetites of people who have always disliked Harry and Meghan. It is about something much simpler and much more important. It is about the veterans, full financial disclosure from the Invictus Games Foundation. Every expense report, every budget line, every transfer, every contract. Examined by independent auditors with no connection to the Sussex organization and no interest in protecting anyone's reputation. A thorough investigation of the governing board, who made which decisions, who approved which expenditures, who sealed which records and on what legal basis. A formal assessment of whether the foundation's insurance failures put participants at risk, and if so, what remediation those participants are owed. And a genuine, fundamental restructuring of the foundation's governance, one that places the mission, the veterans, at the center, and removes the Sussex brand from any position of financial control. These are not punitive demands. They are the baseline requirements of functional charitable governance. Any legitimate organization should welcome them. The fact that there appears to be active resistance to exactly these measures tells you everything. I want to close by talking about something that I think gets lost in stories like this. Lost in the anger, the drama, the legal proceedings, the personality conflicts. There is a man, somewhere, who lost his legs in Helmand Province, who spent 2 years learning to walk again on prosthetics, who trained for months to compete in the Invictus Games, who stood on that podium and wept because in that moment he felt, for the first time since the explosion that changed his life, that he was more than his injuries. He did not think about Harry that day. He did not think about Meghan. He did not think about Netflix or brand deals or designer wardrobes or 5-star hotels. He thought about his family in the crowd. He thought about the other competitors who had become his brothers and sisters. He thought about how far he had come from the darkest moments of his recovery. That man is real. There are hundreds of him, thousands, and they deserve better than to be the charitable cover story for people who allegedly used their sacrifice as a branding opportunity. They deserve better than an organization that couldn't afford to insure them properly because the budget was allegedly consumed by luxury expenses at the top. They deserve better than a foundation that seals its records rather than demonstrate how it served them. They served their countries without hesitation and without reservation. The very least they are owed is honesty. It is past time for the truth. All of it, not the curated truth that Harry and Meghan's communications team release on their schedule through their chosen platforms. The real truth, the documented truth, the financial truth. The records are coming. The law will see to that. And when they arrive, when those pages are finally open to the scrutiny they should never have been protected from, we will all know definitively what this was really about. And I suspect we already know. The veterans knew something was wrong before any of us. They always do. The men and women who have survived the worst that the world can throw at a human being develop an instinct for when they are being used. What we know, factually and without dispute, is this. He was born into extraordinary privilege. He was given by accident of birth access to platforms and audiences and institutional credibility that no amount of talent or effort or merit could have generated. He was handed, essentially for free, the kind of social capital that most human beings could not accumulate in 100 lifetimes. And what did he do with it in the early years? There were genuine signs of substance beneath the privilege. The military service was real. Whatever one thinks of the conflicts in which he served, Harry genuinely served. He was not a ceremonial soldier. He went. He flew combat missions. He came back changed, as all soldiers do, in ways that were not always visible but were clearly real. And the Invictus Games in those early years appeared to be a genuine expression of something he understood, the particular struggles of people who had served and been broken by that service. So there was something there. Something authentic, buried under the layers of privilege and image management and institutional pressure. The critical question, is when that authenticity was buried so deep it stopped mattering. And the answer, according to the emerging evidence, appears to coincide almost precisely with the arrival of Meghan Markle. Now, I want to be careful here. Because the easy narrative, the one that a lot of people default to, is that Meghan is the villain and Harry is the victim. That she corrupted him. That she manipulated a vulnerable man into becoming something he would never have become on his own. I do not entirely buy that narrative, not because Meghan is blameless. The evidence, as it accumulates, suggests she is very far from blameless, but because Harry is a grown man. A man in his late 30s and early 40s who has made decision after decision, each one calculated, each one consequential, each one impossible to attribute entirely to someone else's influence. Harry chose to do the opera interview. Harry chose to write the memoir. Harry chose to sign the Netflix deal. Harry chose to allow, and by all accounts enthusiastically embrace, Meghan's increasing involvement in his charitable foundations. Harry chose, when the Invictus expense reports were being compiled, not to ask the questions that any responsible patron should have asked. Where is the money going? Is it going to the veterans? Can we see the breakdown? Does this align with our mission? Those questions apparently were not asked. Or if they were asked, the answers were accepted without scrutiny. That is not victimhood. That is complicity. Harry is not a naive man led astray by a calculating woman. Harry is a man who found in Meghan a partner whose ambitions aligned with his own desires, for relevance, for financial independence, for the kind of celebrity status that royal protocol had always prevented him from fully pursuing. Together, they did not create a partnership of victim and manipulator. They created a partnership of mutual convenience. And together, they are facing the consequences. Let us get into the specifics of what is alleged, because the details matter enormously here. The details are where the truth lives. A lawsuit valued at $2.4 million. That is the number. That is what is at stake in immediate financial terms. But the number itself is almost secondary to what the lawsuit demands: financial records. Complete, unredacted, comprehensive financial records from the Invictus Games Foundation. Now here is what I want you to understand about that demand. In the world of charitable organizations, financial transparency is not optional. It is not a courtesy, it is a legal and ethical obligation. Charities exist on a social contract. They receive tax benefits, donor trust, and public goodwill in exchange for operating with transparency about how they use the resources entrusted to them. Every pound, every dollar, every euro, donors have a right to know where it went. The fact that there is active resistance to producing these records, the fact that records appear to have been sealed, that disclosure is being fought rather than welcomed, is, in the world of charity law and governance, a five-alarm fire. Legitimate charities do not seal their financial records. Legitimate charities do not fight transparency. Legitimate charities do not require court orders to produce documentation of how they spent donor money. They open the books. They invite scrutiny. They welcome the examination because the examination confirms what they already know, that every pound went where it was supposed to go. The resistance here is not the behavior of people with nothing to hide. It is the behavior of people with a very great deal to hide. Indeed, let us talk about the specific allegations regarding expenses, because this is where the story moves from abstract financial misconduct to something viscerally, tangibly enraging. The allegations supported, it appears, by at least some documentary evidence, is that foundation funds were used to cover personal expenses for Harry and Meghan at a scale that beggars belief. Multiple designer outfits. We are not talking about a single appropriate outfit for a public engagement. We are talking about an apparent wardrobe operation, multiple looks, multiple designers, the kind of sartorial excess that belongs on a red carpet, not in a charity's expense ledger. 5-star hotels, not comfortable hotels, not good hotels, 5-star hotels, the kind of accommodation where the room rate for a single night could fund a veteran's rehabilitation equipment for a month, chauffeur services, premium security arrangements, first class and private travel, all of it allegedly charged to the foundation. Now, let us put this in context. The Invictus Games Foundation exists to serve wounded veterans. Those veterans have real, pressing material needs. Adaptive sports equipment, rehabilitation programs, mental health support, community building infrastructure, travel and accommodation for competitors who by definition face physical challenges that make travel more difficult and more expensive. These are the things the money was supposed to fund. Instead, if the allegations are proven, a significant portion of that money funded the lifestyle of the couple at the top. And here is the detail that I cannot move past, that I keep returning to, that I think should be the defining image of this entire scandal. The Invictus Games, the athletic competition for wounded veterans, reportedly did not have adequate insurance for its participants. The veterans, the people for whom this entire enterprise ostensibly existed, were left inadequately protected. While the expense reports for the couple at the top allegedly ballooned with luxury after luxury, the most basic duty of care for the competitors themselves was neglected. You could not design a more complete moral inversion if you tried. I want to take a moment to address the media dimension of this story, because it is genuinely extraordinary. The United Kingdom has one of the most aggressive, most investigative, most relentlessly probing media landscapes in the world. British journalists broke the phone hacking scandal. They exposed the MP's expenses scandal. They have investigated police corruption, corporate fraud, government malfeasance, and institutional cover-ups of every conceivable variety. And yet, on the story of financial irregularities within the Invictus Games Foundation, a story involving a former senior royal, a registered charity, donor money, and wounded veterans, the silence has been remarkable. Why? The answer, I think, has several layers. The first layer is legal. Harry and Meghan have demonstrated, repeatedly and expensively, that they are willing and able to pursue media organizations through the courts. The legal costs of taking on the Sussex operation are not trivial. Smaller outlets cannot afford the risk. Larger outlets have made editorial calculations about whether the story is worth the inevitable litigation. The second layer is cultural. There is a significant portion of the media class, particularly in the liberal-leaning outlets that command enormous cultural authority, that has decided for ideological reasons that Harry and Meghan represent something worth protecting. To scrutinize their charitable governance feels to these outlets like an attack on progressive values, and progressive values in the current media climate are not things that editors are eager to be seen attacking. The third layer is, frankly, cowardice. Pure, institutional, editorial cowardice. The kind that has always existed in media organizations, that has always protected powerful people from scrutiny they richly deserve, and that has always been dressed up in the language of journalistic responsibility to disguise what it actually is. The result is that a story of genuine public interest, a story about donor money, about the welfare of veterans, about the governance of a registered charity, has been left largely to independent commentators, online journalists, and the occasional brave mainstream voice. That is a failure of the British press. And it is a failure that has allowed this situation to fester for far longer than it should have. Now let us talk about the racism dimension. Because we cannot discuss Harry and Meghan without discussing the racism accusation, and specifically the way it has been deployed as a strategic instrument. The Oprah interview was the pivotal moment. The suggestion, carefully worded, never quite directly stated, always maintained with plausible deniability, that members of the royal family had expressed concerns about the skin color of Harry and Meghan's unborn child. The accusation detonated like a bomb. It dominated global news cycles for weeks. It put the royal family on the back foot in a way that nothing else could have achieved. It created a narrative, Harry and Meghan as victims of institutional racism, that made any subsequent criticism of them politically and socially treacherous. And that, I would argue, was precisely the point. Think about the architecture of it. Before the racism accusation, Harry and Meghan were criticizable. They were a couple who had left the royal family under contentious circumstances, made a series of commercially motivated decisions, and were struggling to manage the public relations consequences of those decisions. They were fair game. After the racism accusation, criticizing them became an act requiring enormous courage, because any critique of their financial management, of their narrative truthfulness, of their charitable governance, could be, and was, immediately reframed as racism adjacent. As an attack on a biracial woman, as complicity in the very institutional prejudice they were claiming to have fled. It was, from a strategic communications perspective, a masterstroke. It was also, if the financial allegations are proven true, a profoundly cynical deployment of one of the most serious accusations that can be leveled in contemporary public life. Using racism as a shield against financial accountability is not progressive. It is not brave. It is not speaking truth to power. It is the exploitation of genuine social pain for personal protection. And it is perhaps the most morally reprehensible element of the entire Sussex operation. Let us talk about INVICTUS. Because Invictus is not the only organization in the Sussex charitable ecosystem, and the questions that are being asked about Invictus will inevitably, if the legal proceedings continue to develop, begin to be asked about INVICTUS as well. The INVICTUS Foundation was established after Harry and Meghan's departure from royal duties. It was presented as their vehicle for philanthropic work, a fresh start, independent of royal structures, reflecting their own values and priorities. Its financial disclosures, such as they are, have attracted scrutiny from charity watchdog organizations and financial analysts. The ratio of administrative expenses to programmatic spending, that is, the proportion of donated money that goes toward the foundation's stated mission versus the proportion that goes toward running the organization itself, has raised eyebrows among people who understand how legitimate charities operate. Now, this is not by itself proof of anything improper. Some charitable organizations have high administrative costs for entirely legitimate reasons. But in the context of the Invictus allegations, in the context of the pattern of financial behavior that is now emerging, these questions take on additional weight. If the Invictus records, when disclosed, reveal systematic misallocation of funds, investigators will not stop there. They will follow the pattern. They will ask whether similar practices were employed across all Sussex-affiliated organizations. INVICTUS is watching the Invictus lawsuit very carefully right now. And it is watching it with fear. I want to spend a moment on what I believe is the most underappreciated element of this story. The element that in the long run may prove to be the most historically significant, the destruction of Prince Harry as a symbol. This matters beyond Harry as an individual, because Harry, whether he intended it or not, became a symbol. For a certain generation in a certain cultural moment, he became the emblem of something that felt genuinely important. The idea that it was possible to walk away from toxic institutions, to prioritize mental health, to challenge inherited hierarchies, to build something authentic on your own terms. For many people, particularly younger people who felt alienated from traditional institutions and traditional values, Harry and Meghan represented a kind of permission. Permission to reject the established order, permission to put yourself first, permission to define your own identity on your own terms. And now that symbol is collapsing, because if the allegations are proven, if it turns out that the man who claimed to be walking away from institutional corruption was allegedly running his own, then the symbolism inverts completely and catastrophically. The story of authentic rebellion becomes the story of cynical exploitation. The hero of the narrative becomes its villain. The institution that was supposedly left behind because of its corruption turns out to have been less corrupt than the thing built to replace it. That inversion will be culturally significant in ways that extend far beyond Harry and Meghan. It will be used for years as an argument against the kind of individualist, anti-institutional narrative that Harry and Meghan popularized. Every person who cited Harry as an example of authentic self-determination will find that example turned against them. Every argument that was built on the Sussex narrative as a foundation will find that foundation crumbling. The collateral damage of this scandal will be enormous, and the people who will pay the price are not just Harry and Meghan. They are everyone who believed in what Harry and Meghan claimed to represent.
Please don't forget to subscribe to our The King YouTube channel to get more updates in the future. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a lovely evening, and we'll be back to see you tomorrow. Bye. I love you all.